Chapter 7, Respondent Conditioning, Pavlov and his famous salivating dogs. Operant conditioning is the type of conditioning related to the behavioral principles of reinforcement, extinction, punishment, and stimulus control. It is the way dogs are trained and develop new skills. When you give a food reward or teach a dog to respond to hand signals, you are manipulating antecedents and consequences. Operant conditioning is at work. There is another process by which the behavior of animal and humans can be changed. That process is called respondent conditioning. It is also known as classical or Pavlovian conditioning, named for Ivan Pavlov, the Russian scientist who first described respondent conditioning in 1927. As we described in Chapter 1, Pavlov showed that dogs salivate when meat powder is placed in their mouths. Then Pavlov presented a neutral stimulus, the sound of a metronome. Just before he put the meat powder in the dog's mouths, after he presented the sound and meat powder together several times, he presented the sound by itself. Pavlov discovered that the dog now salivated when the sound was presented without meat powder. In respondent conditioning, a neutral stimulus can become a conditioned stimulus if it is paired a number of times with an unconditioned stimulus. In respondent conditioning language, an unconditioned stimulus, the meat powder, elicited an unconditioned response, salivation. In the beginning, the sound of the metronome was a neutral stimulus. It eventually became a conditioned stimulus that resulted in the conditional response of the salivation. Respondent conditioning often takes place when dogs are presented with stimuli related to food. A good example is a box of dog biscuits. Dogs can't read, so a box that says dog biscuits on it is a neutral stimulus. It has no meaning for the dog. Suppose you give the dog a biscuit every morning, an unconditioned stimulus, and shake the box before the biscuit is delivered. The first few times you do this, the dog will take the biscuit and begin to salivate, an unconditioned response. But as the days pass, the shaking of the box becomes a conditioned stimulus. Eventually, the dog will salivate, a conditioned response, whenever you shake the box. When this happens, respondent conditioning has taken place. Biology, reflexes, and bodily responses. In both dogs and humans, unconditioned responses have a biological basis related to survival. The unconditioned stimuli and unconditioned responses of respondent conditioning affect the reflexive actions of the glands and smooth muscles. By contrast, operant conditioning involves the stripped muscles that control voluntary activities such as barking, running, and jumping. Respondent conditioning of fear. In their classic 1920 study, Watson and Rayner used respondent conditioning to condition fear in little Albert, an 11-month-old boy. We outlined the experiment briefly in Chapter 1, but to recap, Albert started out with no fear of a white lab rat. The rat was a neutral stimulus. Then as the rat was presented, Watson and Rayner used a hammer to make a loud noise behind the child. The loud noise, an unconditioned stimulus, produced a startle response, an unconditioned response, in Albert, and from then on he had a fear of rats. Fear was his conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus, rats. What do a rat, a hammer, and a little boy have to do with dogs? Many dogs that are fearful have undergone some respondent conditioning that may affect their future behavior. Dog shows are loud, noisy places where equipment is constantly being moved, set up, taken down, or dropped. Many trainers struggle with fearful competition dogs that were fine until someone dropped a stack of chairs just as the judge was approaching with a clipboard. More than one dog owner has taken a shy dog to beginning training classes only to have it attacked on the first night by an aggressive dog. Respondent conditioning. Symbols for explaining respondent conditioning. US equals unconditioned stimulus, NS equals neutral stimulus, CS equals conditioned stimulus, UR equals unconditioned response, CR equals conditioned response. Step 1, US, the biscuit, to the UR, salivation. Dog biscuits in the mouth elicit salivation in the dog. Step 2, NS, shaking box, yields O, no response. The neutral stimulus shaking the box of the dog biscuit produces no response except orientation. Step 3, NS, shaking the box, yields US, the biscuit, yields UR, salivation, which then goes back to NS. The box is shaken, the dog looks, a biscuit is taken out and given to the dog. The dog salivates while eating the biscuit. This is done several times. Step 4, CS, yields CR. CS is shaking the box and CR is salivation. The box is shaken, the dog looks, and the dog salivates before receiving the biscuits. Note, the NS is now referred to as the CS. The UR is now referred to as the CR. Examples of unconditioned responses in dogs. Unconditioned stimulus. Finger touches newborn puppy's lips. Unconditioned response. Sucking reflex. Unconditioned stimulus. Food and mouth. UR. Salivation. US. Object or puff of air in eye. UR. Blinking. US. Squeezing or rub outside of throat. UR. Coughing. US. Pain. UR. Jerking away quickly. Flight or fight response. Run away or aggression. US. Loud noises, unfamiliar, intensive stimuli such as lightning, thunder, a screaming person. UR. Fear and startle reflex, muscle tension, signs of stress such as increased heart rate, respiration, and panting. US. Bright lights in the eyes, and UR. Pupils constrict. A word about words. More and more dog trainers and writers are attempting to teach the concepts operant and respondent conditioning to their students and readers, and it is important that the language be used correctly. In respondent conditioning, behaviors are elicited. This term is used in respondent conditioning, but not in operant condition. Elicit means to bring about or cause. In respondent conditioning, the behaviors that result from elicited stimuli are unconditioned reflex responses, such as eye blinks and salivation. It is thereafter incorrect to say, I was working with a dog to elicit a sit. Sitting on command is a learned behavior, and the term elicit does not apply in the operant context. Some creative dog writers and trainers have experienced terminology drift and now use the term elicit as in I tried to elicit a higher jump. Nope, elicit means improper or unlawful activity. Another word we've seen used a lot in attempting to describe respondent conditioning is solicit, as in you need to solicit the response from the dog. We certainly hope not. Solicit means to beg, plead, or approach for immoral purposes such as prostitution. Respondent conditioning is related to reflexes and responses are elicited. We need to get the language right. To do any less, would be illicit. An understanding of respondent conditioning is particularly useful when you're working with dogs that have become fearful or whose behavior has changed following a physical, painful experience. Is it operant or respondent? Dog trainers are becoming more sophisticated, and the demand for seminars, videos, books, and magazine articles on operant and respondent conditioning is rising. Some people who are teaching these concepts to others have a sufficient background to do so, others do not. When scientific concepts are watered down repeatedly so that everyone can understand them, the result is often information that is inaccurate. Some time ago, we read an article on respondent conditioning that used an example involving a cookie jar. The first person who used the cookie jar example was probably correct, but as others tried to simplify the language and put things into their own words, things got confusing. When we read it, the story said, when a dog sees you rattle the cookie jar and gets excited, respondent conditioning has taken place. That's not accurate. When a dog is excited, it usually wags its tail and jumps around. These are voluntary activities, and they indicate that operant conditioning has taken place. Respondent conditioning involves reflexes, biology, or bodily conditions. If the dog sees you rattle the cookie jar and begins to salivate, respondent conditioning has taken place. The relationship between operant and respondent conditioning can be confusing. Dogs are complex creatures, and sometimes respondent and operant principles overlap. In the cookie jar example, both operant and respondent responses may be factors. Respondent techniques for changing behavior. While it is not very useful to be able to condition dogs to salivate, in fact, we're sure some of you would like to know how to condition dogs to stop salivating, respondent conditioning can be useful in understanding certain types of canine behavior. There are also several ways respondent conditioning can be used to change a dog's behavior. Habituation, counter-conditioning, systematic desensitization, and flooding are the most commonly used respondent methods. Habituation, get used to it. Habituation, sometimes called adaptation, is the process whereby an animal or person begins to have less of a negative reaction to an event after they have been exposed to it several times. For example, a sporting dog being introduced to field work may be startled by the first exposure to loud gunshots. As more and more shots are fired, the dog habituates and the magnitude of the startle decreases. For some responses, such as startle responses, habituation takes place with repeated exposure. Other responses, such as eye blinks, do not habituate. The research on habituation also shows that habituation can be a temporary effect, and if some time passes with no exposure to the stimulus, the response may return to its previous level. Habituation is a gradual decline in the magnitude of the respondent behavior after it has been elicited repeatedly. This means if a poorly socialized dog is habituated to loud, crowded, noisy places, and its owners then stops taking the dog out, the next time the dog is taken to a noisy, frightening place, it may be afraid again. For dogs that are fearful or easily spooked, socialization must be an ongoing, frequent process to ensure that behaviors will be maintained. Counter-conditioning, undoing bad experiences. Counter-conditioning is used to undo the effect of an earlier conditioning experience. In 1924, Mary Cover Jones was the first therapist to use counter-conditioning. She worked with a 3-year-old boy named Peter who had developed an intense fear of rabbits. Jones presented a rabbit at some distance away as she gave Peter some milk and crackers. In respondent terms, a negatively conditioned stimulus, the rabbit, was paired with an unconditioned stimulus, the crackers and milk. The rabbit was gradually moved closer until Peter had the rabbit in his lap. By the end of the therapy, Peter was petting the rabbit with one hand and eating a cracker with the other. Counter-conditioning is particularly useful for working with dogs that are fearful or anxious. Counter-conditioning counters the effect of previous conditioning. Oftentimes, the previous conditioning was in adverse nature. Systematic desensitization, treating fears and anxiety. One type of counter-conditioning is systematic desensitization. Joseph Wolpe developed systematic desensitization in 1958 to treat human behavior problems such as fears, anxiety, and phobias. Phobias are fears that are so extreme they impair or change the way in which one functions. In the original systematic desensitization work, people are taught to relax as they visualize situations that produced fear. The imagined situations progressed from the least fearful to the most fearful situations possible. For example, a person with a dog phobia might visualize watching television. Then they might imagine a television scene including a dog. Once they've learned to relax with this image, the phobic person would progress to imaging a dog at a distance on the street, and eventually to petting the dog. As soon as the person can remain relaxed through each step of their fear hierarchy, exposure to real dogs begins. Dogs are truly brilliant, but telling a fearful dog, "Imagine you were watching television," would obviously not be an effective strategy for changing its behavior. The systematic desensitization procedure used with dogs are called in vivo, the Latin term for in-life procedures, which means they are done in real-life situations without imaginary or visualization. An example of the way this is done is Penny, a 2-year-old Shetland sheepdog whose owner wanted to have her certified as a therapy dog. When Penny was 14 months old, she and her owner were entering a public building as a person in an electric wheelchair was exiting. Penny's owner was trying to hold the door open and hold onto Penny's leash at the same time. Somehow, the leash got tangled in the wheelchair. Penny panicked and got pinched between the door and the wheelchair. After that traumatic experience, Penny was afraid of wheelchairs, large carts, and other moving things on wheels. In order to become certified for therapy work, dogs have to behave acceptably in the presence of healthcare equipment such as wheelchairs, walkers, and crutches. A 10-step systematic desensitization program was designed to address Penny's fear for wheelchairs. 1. An empty wheelchair was placed 20 feet away from Penny. 2. The wheelchair was moved to 10 feet away. 3. The wheelchair was moved to 5 feet away. 4. Penny was taken on a leash to approach the empty wheelchair. 5. A person sat in the wheelchair while it was placed 5 feet away. 6. Penny was taken on a leash to see the person who gave her a treat. 7. The person moved the wheelchair towards Penny starting from 10 feet away. 8. The person moved the wheelchair toward Penny starting from 5 feet away. 9. The person moved the wheelchair towards Penny starting from 3 feet away. 10. The person moved the wheelchair past Penny. Penny's fear of wheelchair was overcome in 7 30-minute sessions. Step 6, where Penny got the treat from the person in the wheelchair, is the key element in defining this behavior modification program as counter-conditioning. Systematic desensitization has 3 main components: relaxation training, a hierarchy ranging from the least to the most problematic situation, and counter-conditioning. Without this reinforcer, the program would have been an example of extinction of a fear response. When working with a dog like Penny, you must give reinforcers for appropriate behaviors. The dog should not be coddled or babied with words like, there, you're okay," when attention is a reinforcer. This kind of coddling can easily shape a dog to be more fearful as it discovers that a fear response makes its owner jump through hoops to keep it happy. Jumping through hoops is okay for dogs, not owners. Flooding, sink or swim. Flooding is almost the direct opposite of systematic desensitization. Systematic desensitization involves overcoming fears gradually and ensuring that the dog or person is comfortable at each level of the fear of hierarchy before proceeding to the next. In flooding, the feared stimuli are presented all at once. In the case of Penny, if flooding had been used to fix her fear of wheelchairs, she would have been quickly taken on a leash to an area near the wheelchair. Almost immediately, the person in the wheelchair would have started moving it close to the dog. The respondent theory behind flooding is that the high level of anxiety and fear will be elicited quickly, and respondent extinction of fear will also occur quickly. Flooding is a let's get this over with quick technique. With dogs, some police and military trainers use flooding to address fearfulness and anxiety. Flooding was also used by old school trainers who believed dogs should be broken. These trainers would not tolerate fearfulness and felt the solution to a spooky dog was to throw the dog right into the fearful situation and not let it escape. With flooding, the dog is exposed to the stimuli for a fixed period of time and escape is not permitted. Flooding has been recommended in the current dog training literature as a way of dealing with fearful dogs. However, we believe systematic desensitization is a much more humane method of dealing with fear in dogs. Flooding can result in an overwhelming anxiety and distress. Dogs subjected to flooding often become so traumatized that they lose control of their bladder and bowels. Some dogs resist flooding so intensely that they become aggressive and dangerous for the average person to handle. The agonizing experiences that can occur in flooding can result in the dog forever associating the handler with the negative experience. Handlers traumatized by a flooding experience gone bad will often give up on their dogs and stop all training. Finally, flooding techniques know positive and adaptive behaviors, and it can easily make a problem worse. Softer, more sensitive breeds can develop a serious behavior problem as the result of intensive procedures like flooding. The last word on respondent conditioning. Respondent conditioning is one of the more difficult areas of animal learning to understand, particularly because respondent behaviors, which are related to reflexes in biology, can frequently overlap operant learned behaviors. Procedures that are operant in nature can be respondent if they are so intense that they elicit fear and other biological reactions. For example, shock devices can be operant or respondent, depending on the strength of the shock. Some trainers recommend putting a mouse trap under some newspapers for dogs that jump on the couch, especially this is an operant procedure. However, if the dog manages to get pinched or is so afraid of the trap springing that reflex changes, such as elevated heart rate and respiration, take place and the procedure has become respondent. Some seminar leaders are now teaching workshops on respondent conditioning. Dog trainers love to be on the cutting edge with new techniques, so more than one dog trainer has told us, I am using a new procedure to train my dog. It is called classical conditioning. In fact, respondent conditioning is far from new, and it is not a training methodology. The primary applications of respondent conditioning are in treating anxiety, fears, and phobias. Understanding respondent principles is particularly useful for someone who is working with a fearful dog. For teaching new skills or for maintaining and improving a dog's performance, your best bet is to rely on the sound use of the principles of operant conditioning.